1929, Scotland, village that vanished every full moon. It began with silence, not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that feels wrong. On the night of March 12th, 1929, the wind stopped moving across the cliffs of Kilmarie, and every lamp in the village flickered, once then died. The sea, always roaring against the jagged coast of western Scotland, turned eerily still. And from that moment, no one in Kilmarie was ever seen again. By morning, the postman found the road into the village blocked by thick, unnatural fog. He could hear the faint creak of a sign swinging somewhere in the mist, but the smell of smoke, bread, and salt air that usually lingered there was gone. Kilmarie had vanished. At first, no one believed it. A storm, perhaps. A landslide. Or maybe the villagers had fled inland for reasons unknown. But when the police arrived from Oban 2 days later, they found an entire town frozen in time. Homes locked from the inside, fires burned out mid-meal, tea still half-poured, and a row of clotheslines swaying gently in the wind. There were no bodies, no blood, no signs of panic, just absence. The constable leading the first search, Angus McCulloch, described it later as a place left behind by time. He wrote in his report, "The air felt heavy, as though the village itself was holding its breath. We heard distant bells, faint like from beneath the earth, and the sound of something moving through the fog. The church stood untouched, doors closed, pews empty. Candles had melted all the way down to their bases, dripping wax across the altar. But the Bible remained open, as if someone had been reading from it, and simply stopped. Outside, the footprints began, hundreds of them, all leading toward the cliffs, toward the mist that hung thickest over the sea. And then, nothing. The prints ended at the edge. By the third day, word spread through nearby towns. Reporters came by train from Edinburgh, photographers with flashbulbs and questions, hoping to capture what Scotland was whispering about, the village that vanished beneath the moon. But something strange happened to them, too. Several journalists later described hearing music in the distance, faint bagpipes echoing from nowhere. One claimed he saw candlelight flickering in windows that were clearly empty. Another swore he saw a figure standing in the fog, facing the sea, unmoving. No one could explain what they found or didn't find. Authorities sealed the area after a week. The official record called it a localized disappearance, the files stamped with a red unresolved. But locals knew better. They said the villagers of Kilmarie had been marked for years, ever since the ancient standing stones on the moors had been disturbed by a road crew the previous winter. The elders had warned them not to touch the stones. They were markers, they said, between this world and another. That night, the moon had risen brighter than it had in a century. And when it did, the lights of Kilmarie went out. By the time investigators returned to Kilmarie, the fog had lifted, but what they found only deepened the horror. Across the village square, in the soft mud and fading snow, were the footprints. Dozens of them, barefoot, small, large, deep impressions that overlapped one another like a frantic dance, all moving in one direction, toward the cliffs. Detective Inspector Alastair Reid arrived from Glasgow to lead the case. He was known for his calm precision, a man who didn't believe in legends, only evidence. But when he stood over the prints, stretching endlessly into the mist, he felt something tighten in his chest. They weren't random. The steps were in perfect rhythm, as if the villagers had been walking in a procession, children among them, some prints barely the size of his palm. He followed the trail with a constable until it reached the cliff's edge. There, the ground grew slick with moss and salt spray. The final prints stopped abruptly, not at the edge but beyond it, as though they had walked straight into the air. The cliffs of Kilmarie rose 200 feet above the sea. The water below was shallow and jagged with black stone. If they had jumped, there would have been bodies, fragments, clothing, something. But divers found nothing. No reiki, no remains. And then, one of them reported hearing something impossible. He described it later in his log. It sounded like chanting, low, rhythmic, coming from beneath the water, like 100 voices carried through the current. The men surfaced pale, and trembling. None of them would go down again after sunset. Reed scoured the village for signs of a collective departure. Carts, wagons, missing possessions. Everything remained. Even the livestock were still in their pens, unfed and restless. Chickens pecked around empty homes. Dogs barked at nothing. He entered the last cottage on the row, the home of a widow named Moira Kellen. Her table was set for one. Beside her plate sat a small silver locket, open. Inside was a faded photograph of a young boy in a sailor's cap. Beneath it, a note. When the bells call, we must answer. Reed pocketed the note, disturbed. That phrase, the bells call, would return again and again in his investigation. Scribbled on scraps of paper, carved into wood, even stitched into a child's torn sleeve. As darkness fell, the inspector stood once more at the edge of the cliffs. The sea below shimmered silver under the rising moon. He stared out over it, exhausted, frustrated, and then, faintly, he heard it. A bell, not from the church behind him, but from somewhere deep below the waterline. Slow, hollow, and with every toll, a shiver passed through the air. He turned sharply and froze. In the distance, along the path back to the village, he saw faint impressions forming in the soft dirt. Fresh footprints, but there was no one there to make them. He watched them appear, one after another, heading toward him, toward the cliffs. The sound of the bell grew louder. He ran. Reed returned to Glasgow weeks later, half his hair gone gray. His report was brief, clinical, stripped of the madness he'd witnessed. But in private, he told his assistant only this: they didn't fall. They followed. And for the rest of his life, whenever the moon grew full, he would draw his curtains and refuse to look outside. Months passed, but the story of Kilmarie refused to fade. Farmers in nearby towns spoke of strange sounds rolling across the highlands on moonlit nights, the low hum of voices carried by the wind. They called it the whispering of amours. In June 1929, a shepherd named Dougal Fraser was herding his flock near the old standing stones when he heard what he thought was laughter. It was faint, lilting, like children playing somewhere far away. But when he climbed the ridge to look, the sound stopped. He saw nothing but fog shifting between the stones. Then came the whisper. It wasn't in any language he knew, but it felt personal, like his name being called from just behind his shoulder. Dougal turned. No one. By dawn, his sheep were scattered, and he refused to return to the hills again. Word spread quickly. Villagers from as far as Skye began avoiding Kilmarie's moors altogether. Some claimed that if you walked too close to the standing stones under a full moon, you could hear the voices of those who had vanished, whispering prayers, calling out to be found. An old woman in Tobermory swore she'd seen figures moving through the fog, translucent, almost glowing, walking hand in hand across the fields before fading into the mist. The stories grew stranger. A group of schoolboys who dared each other to spend a night near the stones never made it past midnight. They came running back, pale as chalk, muttering about faces in the grass and eyes that opened beneath the soil. In late July, a priest named Father Callum arrived from Inverness to bless the moors and calm the growing panic. He carried a lantern, a rosary, and an unshakable faith that the supernatural could be dispelled by light and prayer. For 3 nights, he camped beside the standing stones. For 3 nights, he heard nothing. But on the 4th, the fog came, thick as wool, silent as death. Callum lit his lantern, whispering scripture under his breath. The light flickered, then died. He struck a match. The wind blew it out, and then he heard it, a voice, clear as day, whispering his name. Callum. He spun around, lantern shaking. Out of the fog stepped a figure, a young woman in a tattered dress, her hair wet, her skin pale as marble. Her eyes met his. "The bells," she said softly. "They're calling again." Before he could reply, she turned and walked toward the cliffs. He chased her, stumbling through the heather and mist, shouting, but she was too fast, and then she was gone. When morning came, the priest was found unconscious at the base of one of the stones, his rosary clutched tight in his hand. He awoke hours later, shaking, and refused to speak of what he'd seen again. A week later, the whispers returned, louder this time, and with them came something new. In the stillness of the moors, witnesses began hearing faint church bells tolling in perfect rhythm with the moon's rise. 3 times, always 3, and each time, the fog would roll down from the hills toward Kilmary's empty ruins. Locals stopped counting the moons after that. They simply stayed inside, locked their doors, and prayed the voices would pass them by. Because everyone in the Highlands now believed the same thing, Kilmary hadn't died. It was still calling. By autumn of 1929, Kilmary was little more than a ghost town on paper, cordoned off, studied, whispered about. But one thing had gone unnoticed until a storm cracked open the roof of the old parish church. That's when they found it. A letter, hidden beneath the bell tower floorboards, wrapped in cloth darkened by age and damp air. The letter was discovered by a maintenance worker named Robert Innes, sent by the parish to assess storm damage. He'd climbed the spiral stairs, brushing away cobwebs and bird nests, when a floorboard gave way beneath his boot. Beneath it, something soft sealed in wax. It was addressed to Father Anselm, in God's keeping. But there had never been a priest in Kilmary by that name. The handwriting was elegant, shaky, and old-fashioned, written in brown ink that had faded at the edges. The date, March 11th, 1929, the night before the vanishings. When opened, the first line chilled Robert to the bone. "If this reaches you, Father, then I have failed to stop what is coming." The letter, later turned over to the authorities, was written by the town's schoolteacher, Ailey Kerr. She was one of the most beloved figures in Kilmary, a widow who taught 24 children in the single-room schoolhouse overlooking the loch. Her words, now preserved in brittle ink, described nights filled with strange phenomena, moaning winds that seemed to carry voices, and bells tolling though the rope is untouched. She wrote of a group of villagers who had begun gathering at midnight near the cliffs, speaking of dreams, vivid, haunting dreams of a figure in the water, calling their names. "They say he promises peace," she wrote, "that he can bring back the ones we've lost if we only listen when the bell sounds." She ended the paragraph with something that made investigators shudder decades later. "They're not dreams. The sea is speaking. It is asking for us." The final page was written hastily, smeared by what looked like tears. "Tomorrow the moon will be full. They mean to go to the cliffs and answer the call. I try to reason with them. Even the children are not afraid. They say they hear the singing when they close their eyes. I will ring the church bell to warn them, but I fear the sound will only draw them closer." And then, the final line, almost illegible, "If the bells toll after I am gone, they are not mine." When Robert Innes finished reading, the bell above him began to sway. Once, twice, though there was no wind. The rusted clapper struck the rim with a hollow, trembling sound that echoed through the empty nave below. He dropped the letter and ran. By the time he returned with others, the bell had stopped, and the air inside the church smelled faintly of salt. The letter was later archived in Edinburgh, labeled Evidence, Kilmary Incident, Exhibit 7B. But those who handled it noticed something strange. The paper was dry when found, but over time it began to absorb moisture, as though the ink itself was drawing in water. And when placed under ultraviolet light decades later, faint new words appeared beneath the original text, invisible before. 5 words. "The bells still call me." After that discovery, no one dared climb the tower again. The church doors were sealed with chains, and the villagers of neighboring towns began a tradition that endures to this day. Every full moon, they leave their own church bells unrung, in case, somewhere out on the coast, Kilmarys are still tolling beneath the sea. Of all the stories told about Kilmary, none spread faster or hit harder than the tale of the boy who didn't vanish. His name was Finlay Kerr, 12 years old, the nephew of Ailey Kerr, the schoolteacher who'd written the letter found in the church tower. When the villagers disappeared, Finlay was the only living soul ever confirmed to have been inside Kilmary and survived. But what he said about that night would haunt Scotland for generations. Finley was found 3 days after the disappearances, wandering aimlessly along the road to Broadford. His clothes were soaked in seawater, though he was miles from the shore. His lips were blue, his eyes unfocused. When the constable brought him in, the boy barely spoke for hours. He just kept whispering the same thing. They're not gone. They just changed. When he finally calmed enough to speak, his account was pieced together between sobs and long silences. That night, he said, the moonlight had been too bright, like it wanted to burn the world. The villagers had gathered near the cliffs, holding candles and humming a strange tune. He remembered his aunt, Ailey, standing among them, tears glistening in her eyes. She'd told him to stay inside, no matter what he heard. She locked him in the schoolhouse, gave him a candle, and kissed his forehead. Don't follow the sound, she'd said. But when the bells began tolling, Finley couldn't help himself. He peeked through the window. The air outside shimmered like heat rising from stone. One by one, the villagers began walking toward the cliffs, moving as if in a trance. The moon hung directly above them. Huge, silver, unnatural. He could hear their voices blending into the sound of the waves, forming something like a hymn. But what terrified him most was what came next. From the fog beyond the cliffs, shapes began to emerge. Pale, human-like figures, walking not toward the village but out of the sea. They were dripping wet, their clothes torn and ancient, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. Finley said they looked like the old photographs that hung in the church hall, the ancestors of Kilmarie. They moved slowly, silently, until the two groups met, those from the village and those from the water. And then, in a moment that defied logic, they joined hands. Finley watched as they turned toward the sea together. The fog swallowed them one by one, candles flickering out as if snuffed by invisible hands. The bells tolled 3 times, and then there was only silence. He remembered running. Down the hill, across the moors. He didn't stop until dawn. When rescuers found him days later, he was clutching something tight in his hand, a wet piece of fabric torn from his aunt's shawl. Inside it was a small seashell, still warm to the touch. Doctors later described the boy as deeply traumatized, suffering from hallucinations. They sent him to the Inverary Children's Hospital for rest. But nurses there began to whisper that strange things happened whenever the moon was full. He would sit upright in bed, eyes open, and hum a tune no one recognized. The same tune villagers had been heard singing in the distance before they vanished. When asked where he'd learned it, Finley only smiled faintly. "She teaches me," he'd say, "from the water." He lived another 6 years in the hospital before disappearing from his locked room one foggy night in 1935. The window was open. The bedsheets were wet with salt water. On his pillow lay a single seashell, identical to the one found in his aunt's shawl. The nurses quit that very week. Locals still whisper that if you walk near the ruins of Kilmarie on a clear night and listen closely, you can hear a young boy's voice humming softly from the direction of the cliffs. And if you follow the sound, you'll find nothing there, just the wind, the waves, and footprints leading toward the sea. In 1932, 3 years after Kilmarie vanished, a diving team arrived from Glasgow University to explore the Loch Morven, a deep, blackwater lake less than a mile from the village ruins. Locals had long whispered that Kilmarie's church bells could sometimes be heard from beneath the loch, especially on nights when the moon turned silver. At first, it was dismissed as superstition. But when the divers descended, they found something that changed everything. The water was dark, heavy, and unnaturally still. Even at shallow depths, their lamps barely cut through the gloom. They followed their compass bearings toward the loch center, and there, the silt began to shift. Beneath their boots were fragments of stone, shaped and carved, unmistakably man-made. Walls, steps, a structure buried under centuries of sediment, eerily similar to the foundations of the old Kilmarie church. As they cleared the silt, one diver's hand brushed against something cold and metallic. He lifted it up, a bell, small, ornate, and perfectly preserved. He struck it lightly with his knife. The sound that followed wasn't a chime. It was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the water like a heartbeat. The divers immediately surfaced, shaken. One of them refused to go back down. He claimed he'd felt pressure all around him, as if the lock itself had come alive, whispering, pulsing, breathing. The lead diver, Professor Columbane, was a rational man. He logged every detail meticulously: depth, pressure, sound intensity. But that night, as the men packed their equipment, the lock began to ripple. No wind, no boats, just concentric circles spreading slowly outward from the center. Then came the sound, faint, distant, unmistakable. Church bells, not echoing across the lock, but from within it. 3 distinct tolls, deep and sorrowful, like the world itself mourning something lost. Bane froze. His men fell silent. The sound carried across the surface for nearly a full minute, before fading into the moors. The next morning, the professor wrote only one sentence in his journal. It was not an echo. Something down there answered us. When the artifact were sent to Glasgow for study, more unsettling discoveries emerged. The small bell contained traces of coral and salt, from the ocean, not freshwater. And yet, the lock was entirely landlocked. Geologists couldn't explain it, but historians began piecing together an older, forgotten legend, that the lock and the sea beneath Kilmarie were once connected by an underground channel, a passage said to be sealed centuries earlier after voices began calling through the tide. One diary from 1721 described fishermen hearing hymns beneath the waves whenever the moon was full. And those hymns, it said, always began with 3 tolls. A month after Bane's dive, his assistant was found dead beside the lock. No struggle, no wounds, only damp footprints leading from the water's edge to where he lay. His notebook was missing, but his last telegram to Bane read, "They're singing again." The diving project was abandoned immediately. The lock was declared unsafe for research, its perimeter fenced off by local authorities. But those who live nearby claim that even now, on still nights, you can hear it, the faint, metallic hum of a bell vibrating beneath the black water. And if you stand close enough, if you listen with your eyes closed, you'll swear you can make out words beneath the sound. Something like a prayer or a promise. We are still here. By 1934, official interest in Kilmarie had quieted, but one man refused to let it rest. Dr. Alaric Moffat, an eccentric physicist from Aberdeen, had grown obsessed with the case. He believed that the disappearances were not supernatural, but scientific, the result of a natural phenomenon no one had yet understood. He called it the luminous resonance theory. In his view, certain geological formations, like the cliffs near Kilmarie, could amplify light and sound frequencies during full moons, creating temporal distortions that might disorient living organisms. His peers dismissed him, but when he learned about the diver's discovery of the bell beneath the lock, he packed his instruments and traveled to Kilmarie himself. He arrived alone. Moffat set up camp on the outskirts of the ruins. He carried a telescope, a portable radio receiver, and an array of strange brass devices that glowed faintly when exposed to moonlight. He kept meticulous notes. The villagers of Broadford warned him not to stay past dusk. One old woman told him, "The air there isn't yours after dark." He smiled politely and ignored her. For 2 nights, nothing happened. He measured radiation, recorded sound frequencies, and noted only the usual wind, waves, and the far-off cry of seabirds. But on the 3rd night, the moon rose full and pale over the cliffs, and his instruments began to hum. The dials on his receiver flickered erratically. The brass plates on his table vibrated in sync with an unseen rhythm. He adjusted the tuning, trying to isolate the source. Then, through the static, he heard it, faint, melodic, unmistakably human. A woman's voice, singing. The words were unclear, but the melody was hauntingly slow, rising and falling like the tide. He switched to his recording device, eager to capture it. The air grew colder, heavy with moisture. His breath misted before him. Though his thermometer read nearly 20 degrees warmer than expected. And then the light changed. It was as though the world turned silver. Every object, every blade of grass, every stone began to shimmer faintly. Even the shadows glowed, like ink lit from within. Moffat stumbled backward, shielding his eyes. His radio equipment sparked, the sound growing louder, until it became deafening, a chorus of overlapping voices, whispering in dozens of tones. He turned off the receiver, but the voices continued. They were coming from the cliffs. Driven by curiosity or madness, Moffat grabbed his lantern and followed the sound. The cliffs loomed white beneath the moon, slick with mist. The closer he got, the more he felt it, a deep vibration through the ground, as if the earth itself were humming. At the edge, he looked down and froze. The sea below wasn't dark. It was glowing. Soft blue light pulsed beneath the surface, swirling in slow circles, like something vast was breathing below. Then a shadow moved within it. Large, human-like, reaching upward. The light brightened, and for a single moment he saw faces. Dozens of them, suspended beneath the water, their eyes open, their mouths moving soundlessly. He dropped his lantern. It fell into the waves and vanished. Moffat was found the next morning on the moor road, barefoot, trembling, his clothes soaked. He couldn't remember how he'd escaped, or even how far he'd walked. His notes were later recovered from his tent. The final entry read, "It isn't light. It's memory. The moon reflects what was lost. They are not dead. They are waiting." The recordings he made that night were stored in the archives of Aberdeen University. When played decades later, they contain no voice, no song, only the faint toll of a bell. 3 times, and then silence. In the spring of 1946, 17 years after Kilmary's disappearance, the Scottish coast was slowly healing from the scars of war. But as the world tried to move forward, the past began to stir again in the ruins of that forgotten village. It started with light. Fishermen working off the coast of Mull began reporting strange, flickering glows across the water. Not lightning, not flares, but steady orbs that hovered low over the sea, always above the spot where Kilmary once stood. Some said they looked like lanterns drifting through the fog. Others swore they were eyes. By May, a Royal Air Force radar unit station nearby detected unexplained electromagnetic pulses coming from the same area, perfectly synchronized with the lunar cycle. Every full moon, the signals would rise, sharp, rhythmic, almost musical. The military dismissed it as atmospheric interference. But a few officers, those who'd grown up in the Highlands, knew the stories. One of them, Flight Lieutenant Rory McNeil, requested permission to investigate the ruins. His grandmother had been from Kilmary. She'd vanished with the rest. The Army approved his request. He took a small crew, 2 men, a jeep, and a box of field recording gear, and arrived in Kilmary on June 12th. The fog was waiting for them. At first, the village looked like nothing more than rubble and moss. Walls half swallowed by grass, doorways opening into emptiness. But as night fell and the moon rose over the cliffs, the air changed. A sound began to spread through the mist, faint at first, like a breeze through hollow wood. Then it grew stronger, clearer. Bells. 3 tolls, followed by something even stranger, a low, humming vibration, as if the ground itself was alive. McNeil's men scrambled to record it. The microphones captured the sound, but also something else. Voices layered beneath the tone. Dozens, maybe hundreds, speaking in unison. When slowed down, the recording revealed fragments of words. Gaelic, perhaps, though old, almost unrecognizable. Linguists later translated what little they could. Return home. The light remembers. That night, McNeil walked the ruins alone. His men stayed behind, too shaken to follow. He carried only a torch and his grandmother's old silver locket, the one his mother had given him the day before he left. He found himself drawn toward the cliffs, the same place the villagers had vanished. The mist parted slightly, revealing the sea below, black and still, reflecting the moonlight like glass. He opened the locket, whispering a prayer he barely remembered. And then, faintly from the waves, he heard it, a woman's voice, singing the same tune that Finley Kerr had once hummed in the asylum years before. McNeil froze. He knew the melody. His grandmother had sung it to him as a child. He stepped closer to the edge. The light shifted beneath the water, forming vague silhouettes, people standing hand in hand. And then he saw her, a face in the reflection, smiling up at him. His grandmother. McNeil's men found his torch still burning at the edge of the cliff the next morning. His boots were left neatly beside it, and the locket lay open on the grass. Inside, instead of a photograph, was a tiny seashell, the same kind that had been found in Finley Kerr's hand in 1929. The recording McNeil made that night still exists, sealed in a government archive, labeled classified, acoustic phenomenon/Kilmarie sector. When played, the static clears for just a moment, and a woman's voice can be heard whispering through the distortion, "We never left." From that night on, locals reported seeing faint shadows wandering through the ruins during every full moon, silhouettes moving slowly, as if reliving old routines. Lanterns being lit, doors being opened, life continuing quietly on the other side of the fog. And when the moon sets, the village fades again, leaving nothing behind, except the sound of the sea and the echo of distant bells. In 1948, word of the Kilmarie recordings began to circulate through unofficial military channels. Most dismissed them as tricks of sound, interference, faulty equipment, or the aftereffects of war. But among the few who listened carefully, there was one who could not let it go. Dr. Evelyn Harrow, a Cambridge physicist and folklorist who specialized in acoustic anomalies. When she first heard the recording, it was late at night in a cold lab in London. Static filled the reel, then beneath it, a voice soft and layered, as if coming from under the sea. The clarity terrified her. There was emotion in the sound, grief, memory, presence. She replayed it for hours. By morning, she had sent a formal request to the Ministry of Defense for access to the Kilmarie site. It was denied within days. That denial made her certain something was being hidden. A month later, Dr. Harrow arrived in Scotland on her own terms. She carried a portable sound analyzer, a field camera, and a small journal of Highland folklore. Every page was filled with ancient stories of thin places, points in the world where the barrier between life and death, past and present, weakens under moonlight. Kilmarie, she believed, was one of them. She met an old fisherman in the nearby town of Tobermory who remembered the village before it vanished. He warned her not to go. He said the fog near the cliffs wasn't weather, it was waiting. But she went anyway. When she reached the site, evening was already falling. The remains of Kilmarie were silent, half swallowed by grass and time. She set up her recorder near what had once been the church. The air was unnaturally still. Even the seabirds avoided the cliffs. As the moon began to rise, her equipment started reacting on its own, dials flickering, static building. Then came the low hum, the same frequency detected in the 1946 military recording. She pressed her headphones tight against her ears. Through the sound, faintly, she heard the rhythm of footsteps. Then, a child's laughter. It was impossible. No one else was there. She followed the sound deeper into the ruins until she reached what looked like an old cottage. The doorway was intact, though the walls had crumbled. On the threshold, she noticed a small shell, smooth, polished, glowing faintly in the moonlight. When she picked it up, her recorder spiked violently. The hum turned into whispering. Hundreds of voices overlapping, some weeping, others murmuring names she didn't recognize. Finley, Morag, Alastair. Then beneath it all, one voice grew clearer. "Do not wake us." A sudden wind tore through the ruins, and the fog thickened. Her lantern flickered out. When she relit it seconds later, the cottage was gone. She was standing on the edge of the cliffs. She fled that night, leaving her equipment behind. The next morning, a rescue crew found her wandering miles away, barefoot, muttering the same words again and again. They're not dead. Just waiting. Her notes were confiscated. Her research was never published. But one of her students, years later, leaked a portion of her field journal. In it, she had written a single line underlined 3 times. Kilmarie is not a ghost story. It is a loop, a village caught inside its own memory. Even now, that page remains a mystery. Was the loop metaphorical or literal? Some believe the people of Kilmarie are trapped in the exact moment of their disappearance, reliving it with each full moon. Others think they slipped sideways in time, caught between 2 realities, glimpsed only when the world aligns just right. Whatever the truth, Dr. Harrow vanished herself 2 years later in 1950. Her last letter was sent from the Isle of Mull. It contained no words, just a small seashell wrapped in paper. And under it, written faintly in pencil, "The moon is almost full." By the winter of 1952, Kilmarie had all but disappeared from public memory. The government sealed off the coastal road, citing unstable terrain and safety concerns. The name itself was erased from most modern maps. But there are still nights, especially under a cold, white moon, when locals in the nearby town swear they see something moving in the mist. Lanterns glowing, shadows walking the hills, bells tolling faintly from the cliffs. That year, a journalist named Thomas Calder decided to uncover the truth. He'd grown up hearing the legend of the vanishing village, dismissed it as folklore, until he found a weathered photo in his late father's drawer. The photo showed a young boy standing outside a stone cottage. Behind him was a woman holding a lantern. Both were smiling. The date written on the back, 1929. The location, Kilmarie. And the boy's name, scrawled in pencil, Thomas Calder. Thomas had no memory of that photograph being taken. He'd been adopted after the war and told his family died in an accident. But the image cracked something open, a soft ache in the back of his mind, flashes of fog, bells, and a lullaby he couldn't explain. He had to see it for himself. Against every warning, he traveled to the Scottish coast just before the December full moon, the same cycle under which the first disappearance had occurred 23 years earlier. He parked his car where the old road had collapsed and began walking toward the sea, guided only by moonlight. For hours there was nothing. No sound but the wind, no sight but the endless stretch of gray fog. Then, faintly, a glow appeared ahead. It was the outline of a village, soft, blurred, but unmistakable. Cottages, chimneys, a church bell swaying silently in the wind. He stepped forward, and the air thickened around him. The fog pressed close, cool, and electric. The more he walked, the clearer everything became. He could hear footsteps, voices, the smell of burning wood. A man walked past him, tipping his hat. A child laughed and ran down the lane. They looked alive, unaware of him, as if he were the ghost, not them. Then he saw her, a woman standing near the well, holding a lantern. Her face was soft and kind, but when she turned toward him, his chest seized. He knew that face, the woman from the photograph, his mother. Tears filled his eyes. He tried to call out, but no sound came. She smiled gently, then lifted her free hand, motioning for him to stop. Her lips moved slowly, whispering something he could barely hear over the wind. "Not yet, love. Not yet." Then the bells began, the same 3 tolls that had haunted the village for decades. The light dimmed, the fog swirled violently, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. When Thomas opened his eyes again, he was standing alone on the cliffs. The ruins were gone. The fog had lifted. In his hand, he was holding a small shell. Smooth, white, still warm. Thomas never spoke publicly about what happened that night. But before his death in 1971, he left a sealed envelope for his daughter. Inside was the shell and a handwritten note that read, "Kilmarie is still there. They only come back to remember. When the moon is full, listen, the sea still speaks their names." Today, the stretch of coastline where Kilmarie once stood remains uninhabited. Satellite images show a faint, circular distortion in the waves, as if something beneath the surface still shifts, waiting for the light to return. Every few years, hikers report seeing footprints in the sand where no one walks. Bells heard from nowhere. And sometimes, on quiet nights, if you stand near the cliffs and the fog begins to rise, you might hear a voice carried by the wind, gentle, distant, almost human, whispering through the dark, "We never left."